Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maples, and I'm back today to continue my series on the history of the Red River Gorge's amazing rock climbing community. By the way, if you haven't checked it out, I recently published a book on this history. It's available on Amazon. You can also go to West Virginia University Press and get it from there. Now, this book covers the entire history of the Reds climbing community, but it's interesting that there's always been little pieces of the history that I've just been especially fascinated with. And Military Wall is one of those pieces. I like to talk a lot about Military Wall as being a very pivotal crag in the history in the Red. And it's something that I really focus in on the book, and I'll also continue to talk about in this video series. But today, I want to get after one of the big questions that I've always had about Military Wall, and that's, where did it get its name? Why do we call it Military Wall? And who found Military Wall? We know the first routes, but we don't know tons and tons about that. So I did some digging as part of this book, and I want to share what I've learned. Likewise, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If I missed something, if there's something you want to add to the story, put it in the comments below. Likewise, please share this video with the community. I want to let everybody know this amazing history. And finally, if you could like and subscribe to the channel, I sure appreciate that, because it makes me happy when I wake up in the morning and I got an extra subscriber. All right, so let's talk about Military Wall. You probably have been to Military Wall as a rock climber. You know it's this amazing place. It's obviously one of those super important historical crags. You know, we know from the 1970s it saw a mass of just amazing route development for some really early famous climbers, really from that second generation of Red River Gorge climbers. It was folks like Tom Seibert, we had Martin Hatwork, we have Larry Day, we have Ed Pearsall, we have a lot of other people too working in that area. And then, you know, later on, we see Porter Gerard put in just tons of routes with lots of his colleagues and co-climbers that are really just super popular routes that are climbed even still today. Now, Military Wall has 53 documented routes. There could be more, but that's how many are documented in the guides. There are 9 of these that have been closed. 7 were closed in an archaeological dig I'll talk about a little later, and 2 were closed for a separate archaeological protection area. The name, however, why we call it Military Wall, actually remains a bit of a mystery. And it's weird too, because Military Wall ended up landing at this really weird time in the Reds' history that maybe helped to make it the mystery that it is today. So first off, when does Military Wall first appear? Now, in the guidebooks, the first time Military Wall pops up is actually in Ed Pearsall's 1980 guide. It's listed as Military Walls. And then it only listed a couple of routes. It had GI, Pink Feet, Green Gully, Decay's Way, Jungle Beat, Things That Go Bump in the Night, and Armed Forces. That was it. There was probably more routes being developed there at the time, but that was all the stuff that was listed there. We know that it had been developed earlier, though, because if we look back at the history, even some of the dating in that guide, we know some of these routes were being worked on in 1974. And it always makes us wonder, if we have a route in 1974, was there earlier development? Because that's when we start getting into that early era of climbing when there wasn't a lot of documentation happening. So did the Cumberland climbers do any climbing routes there, for example? Well, let's explore that. We do know first route that we have on the documents is the route GI. And a lot of people, including myself originally, think that Military Wall is named Military Wall because the first route was GI, and that's a military theme, and it just went from there, right? No, surprisingly enough, it has nothing to do with the military. The route was actually called German Irish. Not GI, it was called German Irish. In fact, it ends up being abbreviated in some of these later guides. And so it ends up seeming like this is why it's called Military Wall, but it actually has nothing to do with that. So the folks who put up this route are Tom Seibert and Martin Hackworth. They put this up in 1974, and it's a 130-foot beautiful route to go take a look at. This particular name goes back to Tom and Martin's ethnicities. Tom had a German background, Martin had an Irish background. And it was really exciting because Tom, when I was talking to him in our oral history interview for the book, he remembered that like Martin was just really excited about this name, calling it German Irish, and he wanted to really remember this moment. So that name just ended up sticking. But over time, the routes started being listed as GI. Of course, it's difficult to say that's exactly what caused it because there were other routes that were also listed as military-themed routes that happened before that. So it's not really clear if maybe climbers were just talking about the route and calling it GI for short, and maybe that made people feel like it was a military route. Maybe it was an inside joke. Maybe they were just having fun with that. We don't know for sure. There are a couple of things that we do know beyond that first route. First off, that's that Tom and Martin didn't discover Military Wall. In fact, Tom felt that it already had been there. Now, it's interesting because the Military Wall you see today has a Forest Service trail that actually goes to a very different spot. It goes kind of to the middle of the crag. Well, originally, the user trail would have taken you to the far northeastern corner of it. And Tom mentioned that as they went up that user trail, and it might have been an official Forest Service trail, I've never established that, but it was probably a user trail. When they went up to that user trail to the crag, the very first climbable thing they saw was, in fact, that GI line. And so they just went for it. They said it looked good, they decided to climb it, and they did it. But who else would have been in this area? Well, definitely humans were using this area a lot. In fact, we'll talk about this in some separate videos about Military Wall's use later on. We know for sure there was tons of indigenous use happening in this area. There would have been timber use. There's lots of evidence of oxen poop that basically helped create a protective layer. Maybe it was some grazing too. We don't really know for sure, but there was definitely some animal poop that helped to form a protective layer in that area. As you walk up the current trail that leads you towards to the center, and there's that sheltered area. We saw a lot of that in that area and the archaeological reports on it. There was some niter activity in the area that probably wouldn't have included cattle because niter is something that you would have packed out on like a backpack, but timber definitely would have required something strong to help pull that stuff out, get it to the river, and then get it downstream, most likely to Powell County, which had a very developed timber industry, by the way. So we know that there was human use happening for 100 years back, and then indigenous going back much, much, much further. We know this for sure. So this area was on people's maps. Were there climbers coming through? Well, let's look at the options here. That rough trail goes right through that area. And so we know for sure with rough trail going through there, people probably could have seen Military Wall. It would have been visible in the winter, most likely, when all the leaves are off the trees. So it seems logical that people could have seen it. Hikers could have seen it. Climbers were also using the rough trail to access some other areas. Princess Arch is one that I recall, or Jewel Pinnacle rather, sorry, not Princess Arch. They were also using the D Boone Trail, which as I recall connects into the rough trail. So they were in that area. It's just a question of if they had been climbing there earlier, or maybe they had seen the area, but they had never completed anything. Because, I mean, these are some really early great climbers, so maybe some earlier people attempted it. We just don't really know. But it's one of those areas that definitely was seeing lots of human use pre-Tom and Martin being on site. So in the end, it's still kind of a mystery. Now, if we go back to the recorded records, the records of the guidebooks and what we know about this area, we start with Frank Becker's guide because I still don't have a copy of the Cumberland Climbers Guide. By the way, if you got a copy of the Cumberland Climbers Guide, which would have been circa 1969-70, get in touch with me because I want to have a conversation with you to see if we can scan that for the archives because that's an important, rare historical document that we need to protect. And I'll even do some videos to talk more about it on it if you like. But with Frank Becker's guide, it was done in 1974. And you have to realize that Frank did this 1974 guide as basically a way of remembering the red. Keep in mind that at that time, the second proposed Red River Dam was going on. And as he wrote it, he told me he felt confident and for sure that the Red River Gorge, as they knew it, was going to be lost because of building the dams. So he wanted to protect that and document what the history had been there. He didn't include Military Wall, so if it was happening, he didn't necessarily know about it. The interesting thing, too, is it may have he published the guide earlier than they would have been climbing it, because he definitely was friends with Larry Day. We know Larry Day was there the day they climbed GI. In fact, I got a special mystery fact for you at the end of the video about that. So he would have known about that through that route. It probably was just random chance that it didn't happen. None of the Cumberland climbers that I've talked to remember using Military Wall either. So it doesn't necessarily exclude them, but they just don't remember it being an area that they would have been climbing. And there's nothing really Cumberland climber oriented that's close enough by that makes me think they might have. Now, what about a little later? Do we get anything from the next guide? In 1978, we've got the Ed Benjamin and Ed Pearsall guide that comes out, and that one does not list military walls. It was Ed Pearsall's in 1980 that lists military walls, but in 1978, they did not list it. They did allude to it at the end of the book, and I didn't realize this when I was writing my book, but it's pretty clear when you look at it that they were probably talking about some development happening at Military Wall, but for whatever reason, those routes did not make it into the 78 guide. In the end, we don't know who found Military Wall. Now, I'm hoping that this little conversation will help scout up some memories or maybe encourage some people to ask some friends that might remember back then and share that information in the comments. Likewise, I'd love to do some oral history interviews with anyone who remembers that and has some ideas about who might have found Military Wall. And the name also kind of still remains a mystery. Tom didn't have the answer to that like I hoped that he would in our interview, but it really seems like it may have been just a joke. It may have been something that just kind of happened. We just don't really know. So, with any luck, talking about this is going to help bring up some memories for some other folks, and I really look forward to hearing your comments below about that early history of Military Wall. Now, that military theme continued for quite some time. At some point in the 1980s, we know that GI was how the route was being listed instead of German-Irish. And there were several military-themed routes. 1979, we have Armed Forces, which would have been probably the earliest one, but that means that at some point before 1979, they would have been A, calling this military wall, and B, maybe GI was how they were thinking about it, so maybe that's how they thought it was a military wall. We don't know. That would be a good question for Ed Pearsall and Jim Sharp. Maybe they would have some thoughts on that. Gung Ho pops up. That's Porter Gerard, Mark Williams in the 90s. Left and right turret are Porter Gerard and Shannon Langley worked on those in 91. Those are kind of military themes because turrets seems kind of military. I guess an honorable mention would be Henry Kissinger's Glasses by Jeff Hughes in 92, which kind of seems like it also could be military themed, definitely politically themed. And also there's left flank around the corner, which that's kind of a really interesting thing, that left flank, a military move, would be located right around the corner. But we still don't know how it got its name. Still remains a bit of a exciting mystery that's still unanswered in the Reds' history. Now, we did see a lot of a really amazing later use at Military Wall, and I think as a historian, this is one of the most exciting things about Military Wall, because you have this amazing second generation 1970s climbers, you know, like Larry Day, Ed Pearsall, Martin, Tom, all these amazing people climbing here. And then you also have a lot of that later important sport route growth that makes the Red River Gorge so famous today. You know, Porter Gerard put up a ton of routes in that area, and they're routes, many of them that are still very well known, and people still seek them out to climb them today. There's also two of the bean routes. Tom Souders, Jeff Koenig, they worked on the bean routes. There are several of those across the Red, but Bean Material and Beanstalker are both located at Military Wall. David Hume put up Nagi Papa, a route that I still can't pronounce even to this day. I've just given up. It's David's route. So there you go, the one that starts with Nagi Papa. Anyways, and also Terry Kindred, who had a really amazing history in the Red, sadly no longer with us, put up two routes there, all things considered, and then Parting Gift, which is treated as sort of his last climb, and a route that was named as sort of a way to remember Terry even today. Now, for many of you, when you think of Military Wall, you don't think about any of these things. You actually think about a very famous archaeological dig that happened in November of 2000, and actually center in on that at the heart of my book as being one of these amazing moments in climbing history that, had it not occurred in the way that it did, it probably would not be the Red that we know today that resulted. Because Military Wall had some partial closures that happened, this really changed the way that climbers approach climbing. We began to hear the phrase, if we buy it, they can't take it away, in various forms. And the idea was that if they purchased the properties and began running their own climbing preserves, that this meant the routes would never be closed. In fact, a couple of years later, we start to see Red River Gorge Climbers Coalition popping up with Pendergrass Murray, and of course Muir Valley opening. So these two amazing local climbing organizations opening their own preserves, partly in reaction to that Military Wall dig. And that at that dig, which I'll talk about in a separate video sometime, that's a long conversation to have. But that's resulted in 7 closed routes, including Revival, which is, I know, is one that a lot of people think a lot about as a sort of a proving route. And then there were also 2 later routes that were closed for different reasons. And those, it sounds like there might have been a separate archaeological feature that they were interested in protecting there. And I'll try and get more information on that because I actually don't have a lot of information on those 2 separate route closures. But there you go. That's the history of military wall in a nutshell. Why is it military wall? It's still actually kind of a mystery. It could be because of GI, but then again, maybe something else was happening. Maybe there were some routes that were done between 74 and 80 that were done but didn't get recorded, or maybe they got renamed. There's a lot of history still to uncover with this amazing historic crag, one that is very near and dear to my heart as just an absolutely beautiful place. I promised you a really cool fact though at the end of this video, so let's hit you with that really cool fact. So in doing my research on military wall, I came across something that I had forgotten, and that was that Larry Day was actually there the day that Tom and Martin put up GI. He was there. In fact, he could have just as easily been part of that first ascent, but he was actually nursing a hangover that day. As his own words, he had had a lot to drink the night before, to put that nicely, and he just wasn't feeling it that day. So he ended up kind of sleeping in while Tom and Martin were working on that line in 1974. But when he felt like he could kind of get a little better and had a clearer head, he got up, he walked around, he checked the area, and he ends up finding jungle beet. In fact, this is that magical day that this next historic route, which I remember I think he also did in 74, ends up being discovered. All right, that's all I've got about military wall today. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your comments on what you'd like me to talk about next. I do this because I love it. I want to document as much of this knowledge as I can and share it so everyone has access to it, because eventually I'm going to start forgetting stuff, and I don't want that to happen. Likewise, if there's things that I still don't know and I have to learn, get in touch with me. Leave comments below. Let me know that information so we can get that on the record. Let's document everything we can about the history of the Red River Gorge. This is an amazing place that you have before you. So let's do everything we can to document its history. Make sure and practice leave no trace practices. Take care of this place.